Hi, everybody. So happy to see so many people in here today. As usual, I'm going to hang tight for maybe just 1 minute just to give other people a little bit of extra time to join. There's a lot of new people in here. And as I've said to many of you before, this is our most popular webinar. And so there's actually over 100 people who have signed up for today. Whether everyone actually comes to the live version or not is always a question mark. But I'm excited to have everybody here today and talk about Intext Citations with you. So we'll get started in about 60 seconds just to give any stragglers time to join. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Just some little housekeeping since there are some new people here. My name is Charlotte Rivera. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Writing Lab and have been so since 2017 when it started. So we've had our third birthday. Every semester, I offer between 10 and 12 webinars like this on a variety of topics. Many of you have signed up for more than just today's, but if you did sign up for just today's and you're interested in some of the others, you can still sign up for a future one if you like today's and want to continue. Everyone is by default muted when they are added to this webinar, and I do ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of my speaking, but of course we will have time for questions at the end and you can feel free to unmute yourself then. And I also have the chat box open on the top of my screen at all times, so if you have a question while I'm going, you can feel free to type the question there and I'll get to it when there's a natural space in the presentation for me to pause and get to your questions. So, all right, without further ado, let's talk about Intext Citations. So before we really jump into the nitty-gritty of this, I'm curious, and you can put your answers in the chat box or you can unmute yourself at this point. I'm curious what the difference is between a quote and a paraphrase. This is pretty key to understanding before the rest of the presentation. So what's the difference between quote and paraphrasing? I will wait about 30 seconds when I ask questions like this. All right, so you're here to learn the difference between a quote and a paraphrase. So the difference between a quote and a paraphrase is a quote uses the exact words as the original source. So this is the copy and paste. It's exactly what the original source said. That's the quote. Okay. Now, I won't get into this today, but there are ways you can change a word here or there or leave words out of a quote. It is appropriate in certain cases to do so. So if you have questions about that, you can feel free to ask me because I won't get into it today. But in general, a quote uses the exact words as the original source. It also uses quotation marks. This is really important for showing when you are taking the words from someone else's mouth, so to speak. It's really important that you use those quotation marks where you're basically saying, hey, this wasn't actually my idea. These aren't my words. I took it from someone else. Okay. It also uses page numbers. As I said in my email today, all of our examples are going to be APA. The reason I do APA for this presentation is because almost all of the degree programs here at SCS are using APA as their style guide. I think a couple of you might be using MLA if you're in liberal studies, or you might be using Chicago or Turabian if you're in urban planning, but almost everybody else is using APA, so that's what I'm using for my examples today. So in APA, this is when you're going to use a page number. And by the way, if you're reading something like an article from the New York Times that doesn't have a page, like you're reading something online and there's no page, in that case, you're going to provide a paragraph number. So you really are going to literally count the paragraphs and include a paragraph number for those quotes, okay? On the other hand, a paraphrase includes the main idea of the original, but different words. So you are writing it in your own words, okay? And actually, I apologize, everybody. I actually need to plug my computer in. I forgot to plug it in. So I'm going to pause this for just 1 second, plug my computer in, and then I will join you again in just about 30 seconds. So sorry about that. Oops, and now I lost my screen share. Just a second. So sorry about that, everybody. That has never happened to me before. All right, so a paraphrase, I will bring my screen share back up, but a paraphrase, as I mentioned, is going to use the main idea of the original, but in your own words. And here's my screen back up. Okay. And as you can see on my preview there, you don't use quotation marks for a paraphrase since they are not the exact words from your original source. Okay, but you will not need to use the page numbers either with APA. These rules are different if you're using MLA or Chicago Turabian, but again, with APA, we're not needing to use page numbers for our citations, but you do still need to include the citation when you're giving a paraphrase. Okay, so in both of these cases, you are including a citation of some sort. It's just, are you using page or paragraph numbers or not? Okay. And I've lost my chat box. Okay, I know somebody put a question in the chat, but because of my changing my screen share, I've lost the chat box, so I'll check that in just a second. A paraphrase is not the same as a summary. The reason I say this and bring this up is because a summary, by definition, is going to be shorter than the original source. A paraphrase, the length doesn't actually matter. A paraphrase could be the same length as the original. It could be even longer than the original. A summary is also, it also tends to be of a longer work, like you're doing a summary of the entire work, where the paraphrase, you're more likely to be just taking a sentence or two or a paragraph or two and condensing them or rewording them. So it's really not the same as a summary, although they are kind of related. So it's really important that in-text citations are integrated. And again, I know there was a question or comment or chat in the chat, and I'll check that in just a moment. Okay, so integrating citations, I'm going to talk about ways that you can integrate the citations in your actual work. So I'm going to talk about 3 different methods that we'll use. So the first is parenthetical citations, then we'll talk about reporting verbs, and then we'll talk about signal phrases. So these are how the actual citations are going to look when you have written them in your paragraph. Okay. So here's an example of a parenthetical citation. By the way, all of my example quotes and paraphrases come from an article I read several years ago about bees and pollinators in the Washington Post. So it's not that I just love bees, I just happen to love this article. Highly recommend it. So here's a quote, and that's integrated in my actual paragraph or in my actual sentence here. Because they allow certain fruits and vegetables to grow, our nutritional security is intimately linked to pollinators. So here it's very clear where the quote from Harvey, the author, actually begins and ends. And you'll notice here that I have a paragraph number there. Okay, you can compare that to my paraphrase. Okay, now there's no words from Harvey in this case, or the ideas are from Harvey, but the words are mine. Because they allow certain fruits and vegetables to grow, pollinators are integral to dependable sources of nutrition. So what makes this a parenthetical citation is that we have everything from the citation, all the important information in a parenthesis, okay? So we have author's last name, and again, this is APA, the author's last name, There is no need for an initial. A lot of times people think that because the initial is there in the end of text citation, that we need the initial in the in-text. That's not the case. We just use the last name, the year that the work was published, and in the case of a quote, we'll include our paragraph or page number. Okay, so this is a parenthetical citation. This is probably the most common type of citation because you don't really need to work any of the grammar differently in what you're writing. You can just stick the citation right in there in your sentences. Okay, that makes it a little bit different from our reporting verbs and signal phrases. So here's an example with a reporting verb. A reporting verb is any type of verb that we would use to report what someone has said. So a word like said, argued, stated, described, okay? All of those verbs are reporting verbs, okay? And we can use those when we're giving citations in our work as well. So in this particular case, instead of the entire citation being in parentheses, it's actually broken up, and I mentioned the name of the author in my text. So grammatically, I say Harvey argued. Okay, so the actual citation is a part of my sentence now. So notice in my quote how the citation is broken up. I say Harvey 2016 argued, and then at the very end of the quote, that's where I put my page or paragraph number. So it gets broken up a little bit with a reporting verb with a quote, okay? So again, I'm saying Harvey argued. I'm putting 2016. That year is always going to go right next to the author. That stays, they're partners, okay? But then the page or paragraph number, if you're using a quote, will get moved to the end of the quote. Compare that to our paraphrase, which is very similar. We still have the Harvey 2016 argued, but there, in this case, again, there's no need for a page or paragraph number because we're not using an actual word-for-word quote in our paraphrase. And then finally, we have our signal phrases. So in our signal phrases, we have according to Harvey, because they allow certain vegetables. Okay, so this is, the rest of it's the same, but the signal phrase is the according to, okay? Or as can be found in, or has been argued by, you know, things like that are signal phrases. A little bit different from reporting verbs in terms of the grammar, but in how we actually structure the citation, it's really the same as the reporting verb. So you can see here that Harvey is part of my sentence. I would actually say Harvey aloud if I'm reading it aloud. And I have Harvey, the name, and I have 2016, and then I've broken up the page or paragraph number at the end. So that format's the same, and we can see it's very similar again with paraphrases. Okay. Now, one thing that's really important that I want you to notice with all of my quote examples is that none of these quotes are standing alone as one sentence. I'm going to repeat that again. You never, ever, ever want a sentence that is just fully in quotation marks. It begins and ends with a quotation mark. I like to call those naked quotes. Sometimes they're called standalone quotes. But you never just copy and paste an entire sentence from an author into your work without any of your words before or after it in the sentence. So the easiest thing to do is to just say according to, and then you can put your citation in there, but it would be even better to paraphrase pieces of it, okay? So we want to really avoid just copy and pasted sentences that are completely a quote, okay? So a question I get very commonly, and actually I'm going to take this moment to try to look at my chat, which Zoom is not letting me look at, so just a second. A very common question that I get, it's still not showing me my chat. Sorry, everybody. Oh, yes, you will get a copy of the presentation. Everyone will get a copy of this PowerPoint, okay? All right. So I get a very common question, what if everything in my paragraph is from the same author? I get this question all the time. The answer is that you do need to cite every idea that is not from your own brain. You need to cite it every time. So just putting one citation at the end of a paragraph is not enough because your reader doesn't know if it was just that last sentence of the paragraph that was from the author or if it was other pieces. So it needs to be after every sentence or even after every phrase in a sentence that is not from your own brain. So even if it's from the same author, it's not enough to just put one citation at the end of the paragraph. So here's an example. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph to you, but when you look at it, you can see there are 4 citations here, 4 parenthetical citations. Um, there's nothing wrong with this, okay? So I will say there's nothing wrong with this. This is completely correct, but a lot of students don't like this because they feel like it's a little bit redundant or repetitive, okay? So if you don't like this, there are a couple of different things you can do. One option would be to change things around and use different types of the citation forms. So we have all parenthetical citations here, but we could do a mix of reporting verbs and signal phrases. So here I've combined some of the sentences and I say according to, and I have a signal phrase, and I've combined 2 sentences, and then I have a parenthetical citation you can see in green, and then I have another reporting verb, Viglione argues. So if you don't want something that just looks repetitive like this, which again is not wrong, there's nothing wrong with this, but if you don't like how it looks, you don't like the style of it, then you can go ahead and just change up the different type of citation you're using. Another option would be to find another author, to find another source, and break it up a little bit. It's one of those things where you can never really have too many sources. So if all of your information about a certain topic is only coming from one source, that might actually be a problem in itself for your research. So you may just want to find somebody else who agrees or disagrees or is related to the ideas that you're quoting from your original author. Okay, so again, if it's all from one author, you cannot just do one citation at the end of the paragraph. It still needs to be every sentence or every phrase. You can vary the type and or you can add in information from another author. Okay. Oh, and I think I've just summarized this. Okay. If you are writing a type of homework assignment where you are just doing a summary and analysis of one author, and it's very clear that you're not switching through different works or switching through um, different different authors or anything like that, you can just say things like the author mentions. You don't necessarily need to use a citation every time in this particular type of assignment because it's very clear that you're really only summarizing or analyzing one piece of work, okay? So this would be the one exception in which an actual formal citation is not always needed. But even in a case like this, I would say it's never gonna hurt to cite. Your professor is never gonna take points away for you citing. So I like to play it on the safer side and just use formal citations every time. But again, if you're doing something a little more informal or a weekly assignment where you're just summarizing what you read and it's very clear that it's one author, you don't necessarily need to worry about the citations quite so much, but you can always be safe. All right, so the question of when we should quote or paraphrase. So I'm going to send to all of you in the chat a link. Okay, actually, I'm going to take a break here and look at my chat box. So sorry, everyone. Everything went off the rails when I forgot my charger. Okay. Do you need to include a page number? As I mentioned, with a paraphrase, you don't need to use a page number. It's only with direct quotes that you need to use a page number or paragraph number. Someone says, what if you have a direct quote mid-sentence with your own words before and after? Do you put the citation immediately after the quoted text or at the end of the sentence? Excellent question. That's a really good question. You would put it directly after the quoted text. So it would be, you know, Charla, 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 me, okay? And then I have a quote from somebody and I'd put my citation immediately after that quote. And then I would continue blah, 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 with whatever else I'm saying. Your citation is going to go immediately after that quote. Because otherwise you could be saying that the other words that you say after the quote are also from that author. So you'll just put it immediately after the quote every time. That was a good question. All right, you're going to see in the chat box a link up here. And what I'm going to share my screen with you really quickly just so you can see what we're looking at. And then I'm going to give you a minute or so to read it over yourself. But what we're looking at here is 4 examples of quotes and paraphrases that are integrated, okay? I have A, B, C, D. I want you to read each of these and rank them from the best to worst in terms of their use of integrating the quotes, okay? So I'm gonna give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes to just read this over, okay? And think, okay, is this a good example? Does my professor want to see this example? Or is this maybe not so strong, okay? So I've just sent you the link to this in the chat. You can open that yourself and read them over. I'll give you maybe about 1 minute to read them over, and we'll come back together and discuss the strongest and maybe not so strong examples in here. So what do you think? A, B, C, D, you can just type it in the chat. Again, I'll wait about 30 seconds for this weakest example. Okay, we have some disagreement in here in the chat, and I think some of you are just waiting to see what I tell you. So let's look at them together. I'll share my screen really quickly here. So the actual weakest example is A. And the reason A is the weakest example is because this is my naked quote, my standalone quote that I was describing. So please look at A and see we have a sentence that says there are many problems that threaten bees, period. And then the rest of the paragraph is a quote. This is not very strong. This is not showing that you understood what you read. This does not show that you can integrate it with your own ideas. This is just a copy and paste from the original author. So this is what we would consider a naked quote and is not very strong to be using in your research, okay? So I would say A is the weakest example. Now, of the 4, what do you think is the strongest example, the best example that your professor would want to see? Okay. Again, a little bit of disagreement. So I will tell you, and actually I'll share my screen again. I will tell you that B and D are the 2 stronger ones. So if you're saying B or D, I would consider both of these to be successful integrations of quotes. I think the absolute strongest one out of these 4 is D, because it does break up the quotes the most. It varies it between quotes and paraphrases. So it's not just full sentences that are being copied and pasted. B is not so bad because we can see that the quote is broken up. There's some interpretation in between the quotes. So if your professor got a paragraph like B, they would still be perfectly happy. But D is the best example because it actually uses the least amount of quotes. And as I go on in my presentation, and I'll try to wrap up pretty quickly, D is the best example because it's the fewest amount of quotes. And when we're writing at the graduate level, you want to paraphrase more than you quote. You actually want to quote as little as possible, okay? You really only want to quote when it's, and I'll tell you when you'll want to quote, but it's really a very special, certain circumstances when you're going to choose to quote versus paraphrase. So let's continue on with the PowerPoint. Now I'm going to lose my chat box again, so I'm just going to finish up this presentation, and any questions that I get, I'll get to at the end. I apologize about the snafu. Okay. So that was the original quote. So the question, I'm telling you, you should quote as little as possible, but when should I quote? So use direct quotes very sparingly at the graduate level. Okay, you can use them to provide indisputable evidence of an incredible claim. So if you're reading somebody and they just make this amazing claim, or they just have amazing results from a study, then you can quote them because you're basically saying, hey, I didn't make this up. I am not misinterpreting it. Here is word for word what my source said. Okay? Especially if you're in liberal studies or you're reading literature or philosophy or something like that. If there's an idea that's being stated in a very striking, unique way, you can choose to quote then because, you know, the author did something quite artfully and you don't want to ruin that. This is a little less applicable to some of the other degrees, but if you're in liberal studies and you're doing some philosophy work, some philosophy writing, you might be deciding stylistically to just keep the art of some of your original writers. Okay. You can also use a direct quote if you're going to analyze it. So if you are going to take a paragraph or a few sentences and you're going to analyze them very closely, you can quote them to serve as a passage. Okay. And if there's any new or unfamiliar terms that were coined by the author, or there's just a very good definition by the author, then you can use that as a quote as well to define your terms. Okay. So when should you paraphrase? Literally the rest of the time. Almost all of the time, you should be paraphrasing rather than quoting when we're writing at a graduate level. Okay. You can use paraphrases to maintain the flow of the writing. This is really important. Everybody has a different voice when they write, and so it can feel a little bit choppy to be moving between different voices, author A, author B, and then you. So using paraphrases allows us to read along in your voice, and it feels a little bit more smooth. It also allows you to eliminate less relevant information. Maybe the only real useful information for you on the entire page from the author was at the beginning and at the end. So if you just paraphrase those things, then you don't need to worry about everything that came in the middle. If you did use a quote, it's useful to paraphrase maybe after the quote to allow your reader to kind of see how you're interpreting that quote. It allows you to explain the quote for your reader, especially if it's something that might be difficult to understand or difficult to parse. Okay? And I think that's actually it. So I'm going to stop my sharing now and open the floor for some questions. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them that way. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. If you do need to run and grab some lunch before your next meeting, feel free to go. But I will hang out for the next 5 or 10 minutes to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you again for joining us today.